It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Mann. Mike is Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State with joint appointments in the Department of Geosciences and the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. He's also Director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center. Mike was a lead author on the Observed Climate Variability and Change chapter of IPCC Third Assessment in 2001, and was on the organizing committee and was a chair for the National Academy of Sciences Frontiers of Science in 2003. He has received many honors, awards, including the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, which is known as also known as Outstanding Publication Award, and selection by the Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology in 2002. He's probably most famously known for the hockey stick, a plot of the past millennium temperature that shows the drastic influence of humans in the 20th century. He was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He's a fellow of AGU-AMS, the Geological Society of America, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Mike is an author and co-author of more than 200 peer-reviewed publications and many op-eds, commentaries, and 5 books, including his latest, which he will talk about, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. Mike, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Jean-Francois. And thanks, Roberta, for making this happen. It's an honor to be here speaking to all of you virtually. I wish I was at the Mesa Lab. It's one of my favorite places to visit, but unfortunately this time it'll have to be virtual. I do hope that on the other side of this pandemic, I'll have a chance to make it back there one of these days soon. In fact, some of my formative early experiences were with the CGD group at the Mesa Lab back in summer of 1994, when I was just a couple years into my PhD. I came out to spend 2 weeks at NCAR up at the Mesa Lab with a number of other graduate students in what I believe was the inaugural NSF Statistical Climatology workshop, and had the opportunity to meet so many figures that loomed so large, people whose articles I had read and was intimidated by when I arrived at NCAR for that workshop. It's been truly a pleasure and an honor to actually collaborate with some of those folks now over the years. And looking at the participant list, I see a number of friends there. And so it's great to be back virtually here at NCAR. I am going to talk about, and I'll try to talk for about 15 minutes or so we have some time for question and answer. Let's see, I need to share my screen. So let me do that. And it let me, great. Doesn't always happen. Okay, so, all right, you should all see the, okay, great. Thanks. So how to win the new climate war, the fight to take back our planet. This is a book that I've written about sort of where we stand now in the effort to not just communicate the science and its implications, but to actually see meaningful action on climate. Back in 1994, when I was attending that workshop, of course, the IPCC hadn't yet even come to the official conclusion that there was a discernible human influence on our climate that would happen the next year with the second assessment report of the IPCC. And the science has come quite a long ways since then, but there hasn't been quite as much progress in actually doing something about the problem as we would like there to be. And so this is really the story of sort of the struggle that we've had to communicate the science in the face of a concerted effort to confuse the public and policymakers by vested interests. And the fact that now with the impacts of climate change having become so vivid that people can literally see them with their own 2 eyes, it's very difficult for the forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists, to deny that climate change is happening. So instead, they've turned to an array of tactics in their effort to keep us from actually transitioning off of fossil fuels. And so these are the obstacles still in our path as we come so close to finally seeing the action that many of us have worked towards for so long. And so I want to start out by reviewing the basic scientific projections. Of course, with this group, I'm preaching to the choir. You all know about the models, you know what the projections are. What I'd like to point out is back in the 1970s, and into the early 1980s, when Warren Washington, my good friend Warren Washington, was at NCAR modeling the Asian summer monsoon, modeling the last ice age. So sort of modeling was starting to come into its own. I believe Sempner and Chervin had developed the first dynamic ocean model, and there were initial efforts now towards coupled ocean atmosphere modeling. So that's sort of where the science was. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to us, ExxonMobil was doing their own climate science, their own modeling. And what's rather sobering is that they made a prediction far more skillful than any of the independent scientists in the field had been able to make at that time. Unbeknownst to us, this is from a report actually from the early 1980s, where what was amazing, ExxonMobil not only correctly predicted the warming effect of increased greenhouse gases, they actually predicted what greenhouse gas concentrations, what CO2 levels would be today. They were so confident in their ability to prevent any meaningful policy action that they knew we would probably be up around 420 parts per million CO2 at this time. And they predicted, when you take into account the different baseline they're using here, a warming of a little more than 1 degree Celsius. So they were spot on. It was an impressive prediction. But what did ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests do? They didn't come public with what they had found. Instead, they engaged in a billions of dollars effort to discredit independent scientists who were actually coming to the same conclusion. And they engaged in a millions of dollars massive disinformation campaign to discredit the science of climate change and to discredit the scientists who were doing the science. Well, what was the cost of that? You've probably all seen curves of this sort. If we had acted on this problem, say back in the late 1990s or around 2000, we would have had a fairly gentle sort of downslope in ramping down carbon emissions to avoid warming the planet more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, often held as a target that we don't really want to go beyond. What decades of inaction has bought us instead is a much, of course, you're all out there in Boulder, you know about double diamond ski slopes. We've gone from what would have been a bunny slope that I could do to what is now a double diamond slope. That's how dramatically we need to bring those carbon emissions down, because we haven't seen the action that we should have seen when we knew we had a problem decades ago. And the impacts, as I said before, we're seeing them play out in real time. They're no longer subtle. I did a sabbatical in Australia last year. I was there for one of the most profound examples of the devastating consequences now of human-caused climate change in the form of these unprecedented bushfires they experienced during what they now call the Black Summer, which I happened to be there for doing a sabbatical, and I watched it happen in real time. So unprecedented heat waves, wildfires, droughts, floods, superstorms. We know the litany. Death Valley, hottest reliably recorded temperature on record now. Unprecedented wildfires in California, but also Colorado. Again, you have seen the face of climate change out there in Colorado. An unprecedented hurricane season, which I'm very proud to say we came the closest. That's the good news. The bad news is we still underpredicted this season. We predicted as many as 24 named storms, which was the largest preseason prediction. Nobody imagined we would see 30 named storms in a season. I didn't think I would live to see a season with 30 named storms, but we're there now. Unprecedented levels of activity, and we know it's tied to warming ocean temperatures. especially the intensity of these storms, the increase in intensity of hurricanes and typhoons around the world, we know can be tied to the increased energy from a warmer climate, from warmer oceans, which provide more energy. This, to me, is a fascinating satellite loop. This is just a snapshot that captured, some of you may have seen this in October, it captured these twin assaults while the West was on fire, including Colorado, and we were witnessing this unprecedented hurricane season back east. One of these storms, Epsilon, the 26th named storm of the season, we can see in the image how it is entraining in smoke, a smoke plume from the wildfires out west, from the Colorado wildfires that were taking place at the time. So this one image sort of captures these twin threats that we know are being exacerbated by climate change. All right, so the evidence, again, it's not subtle anymore. We know it's happening. We know it is now leading to increasingly dangerous consequences. But there has been an effort to discredit the science. I want to play a, this is a clip from a testimony to the House Science Committee that I was involved in back in March 2017. The chair of that committee was Lamar Smith of Texas, a climate change denier. And we had a little exchange here that I think captures sort of the zeitgeist of those times.
According to an article that came out a few days ago in the journal Science, Chairman Smith was on record at the Heartland Institute. This is a climate change denying Koch brothers funded outlet that has a climate change denier conference every year. And Chairman Smith spoke at that conference.
Dr. Mann, don't mischaracterize that.
Well, let me finish my.
No, they do not say that they are deniers, and you should not say that they are either.
Well, we can have that discussion. I'd be happy to. Let me finish.
Be accurate in your description.
I stand by my statement. So can I finish my point?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Yes. So he indicated at this conference that he, according to Science, and I'm quoting from them, he sees his role in this committee as a tool to advance his political agenda rather than a forum to examine important issues facing the U.S. research community. As a scientist, I find that deeply disturbing.
Dr. Mann, who said that?
This is according to Science Magazine, one of the most respected outlets.
And who are they quoting?
This is the author, Jeffrey Mervis, who wrote that article. I'd be happy to send to committee the article.
That is not known as an objective writer or magazine.
Well, it's Science Magazine. Yeah,
So there you are. That's where we were in 2017, where science wasn't apparently not an objective arbiter of science. But we've come a long ways. Denial, as I've already alluded to, is largely behind us because it just doesn't work anymore. And you can be sure that the focus groups and polling done by Republican pollsters tells them that they can't get away with denying it anymore because the public knows that something's happening. So it doesn't mean the fossil fuel industry and those promoting them have just rolled over, but what they have done is they've turned to a new array of tactics, stalling tactics, efforts to deflect attention away from the needed systemic solutions, anything but solving the problem at its source, which is getting off of fossil fuels. And I call this the new climate war. And it consists of soft denial, the denial that not that it's happening, but that it's really a problem. And there's some doozies here. Here's Bjorn Lundberg, this supposed skeptical environmentalist, who, as you can see, points to this little blip in the sea level curve as apparent evidence that things are getting better. And when you look at that few years that he isolated in context in that red circle, you can see how the sort of soft denialists cherry pick data and try to downplay the impacts that climate change is having. And they get a lot of play in conservative media. And it isn't just Bjorn Lundberg. There are other copycats who engage in the same sort of soft denialism. Then there's delay tactics. By talking about innovation and adaptation, again, anything but mitigation. We have Marco Rubio, we should just adapt to sea level rise, as if we'll somehow be able to grow fins and gills, because that's really the only way we would be able to deal with the inundation of our coastlines from sea level rise. Similar things down in Australia with their Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who likes to talk about adaptation and resilience, but hates to do anything to actually help wean Australia off of fossil fuels. Or geoengineering. We could engage in some other massive, unprecedented intervention with the global climate system, and maybe we'll get lucky and it'll offset global warming, but maybe not. This particular special on Nova, PBS Nova last year, was sponsored by David Koch, one of the Koch brothers. Again, a way of changing the conversation, deflection. The Crying Indian ad. I don't know, some of you, if you're of my generation, will remember this advertisement growing up. It was alerting us to, you know, the terrible problem of pollution, bottle and can litter that was polluting our rivers and countryside. And this commercial, this soul tear running down the face of this Native American, Iron Eyes Cody. Actually, he was an Italian American. And that wasn't the only subterfuge in this commercial, because what it was trying to do was to get us to think about this problem as one that requires individuals to act. With the beverage industry, who funded, as it turns out, this campaign, it was hatched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola, advertising executives working for Coca-Cola and other beverage industry groups. The intention of this commercial was to deflect attention away from systemic solutions like bottle bills that were starting to pass in the various states that would require a deposit on bottles and cans. It would hurt the bottom line of the beverage industry because they'd have to process the returned bottles and cans. It would dip into their profits, but it would solve this problem at a systemic level. They didn't want that to happen. And so instead they funded this advertising campaign to, again, deflect attention away from systemic solutions to individual behavior. If that sounds familiar, it's because the fossil fuel industry is running with that playbook right now. They have for several years. The idea of the concept of an individual carbon footprint was put forward by BP in the early 2000s. They provided, I believe, the first carbon footprint calculator because they wanted you looking at your carbon footprint, not theirs. The fossil fuel industry, of course, has the overwhelming carbon footprint when it comes to where these emissions are coming from. And mainstream media outlets like the New York Times have readily bought into this framing. And so we see so many articles now, so much discussion about the individual things we can do as consumers, devoid of the context, the necessary context of what we need to do systemically to solve this problem. Neither you nor I can put a price on carbon, can provide subsidies for renewable energy, can build clean energy infrastructure, or any of these things. We need our politicians, our policymakers to do that. And only through policies that represent our interests rather than the polluting interests will we see those sorts of changes. Then there is division, divide us up. One great way to do that is by taking some of the leaders, like John Kerry, the current special envoy on climate under President Joe Biden. Take our opinion leaders, some of the most prominent voices in the climate sphere, and tar them, attack them over their supposed hypocrisy if they fly. They make use of air travel, fly on a personal jet, or they're not vegetarians, they eat meat, or any number of things to distract us, to get us, once again, talking about individual behavior rather than systemic solutions, and at the same time, sort of rendering some of our most important opinion leaders and leaders of the climate movement, rendering them less effective by discrediting them as hypocrites. Another way to divide us is to, focus on, liberal icons like Michael Moore, Bowling for Columbine. Some of you would be familiar with him for his movie about sort of the gun lobby and the tragedy that took place in Colorado in Columbine some years ago because of our lax gun laws. Sort of a liberal icon, and yet to the surprise and dismay of many environmentalists, he came out with this movie last year, Planet of the Humans, which attempted to discredit renewable energy. And it was really seen as a full-on assault on meaningful climate action, because renewable energy is really our best vehicle for decarbonizing our civilization. Why would Michael Moore do that? Well, you nor I, have any particular insights into his mind, into his psychology, and we could speculate as to why he might have done that. And I do speculate a little bit in the book, but the bottom line isn't so much why he did it, it's who promoted his message and who promoted his film. And indeed, it was the usual suspects: fossil fuel interest, the conservative media, the Heartland Institute, Breitbart News. They loved this. What a way to divide the climate movement, by getting one of their own leaders to now actually undermine something that the movement has been working towards for some time. Finally, and I'm going to try to wrap it up, doomism, doom and gloom. It's too late to do anything about it. If we think it's too late to solve the problem, why do anything? It potentially leads us down the same path of inaction as outright denial. So what do we need to do to win this war? We need to both recognize the urgency of action and the agency that still exists. We can still solve this problem. It's not too late. We can still bring carbon emissions down quickly enough to avert catastrophic 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius warming of the planet. And sorry, Bill Gates, we don't need a miracle. We already have the solution. The sun, the wind, geothermal, clean energy solutions are already there. We just need the political will to scale them up and to provide proper incentives. We've seen carbon emissions flatten in recent years. We actually saw them come down. At least fossil fuel electricity generation emissions came down 2 years ago, and total carbon emissions came down this year, in part due to the social distancing and the slowdown in the economy due to coronavirus. And I'll come back to that. But we've seen a tremendous uptick in sort of the market share of renewables in the energy industry. We're moving in the right direction. We need to move there faster. And yes, carbon emissions dropped 7% last year globally. And if we keep that up for the next 10 years, we remain on course to keep warming potentially below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the good news. The bad news is that sort of lifestyle changes, the sort of temporary changes that gave us this large reduction last year, only get us that far. We need another 7% this year and another % next year. And beyond that, the only way we're going to do that is by decarbonizing our economy, by decarbonizing our civilization. So we've got a lot more work to do, but we now have a president who is enacting bold climate legislation. We've got a Congress that I think will actually bring a climate bill to a vote and likely pass it, or a set of climate bills, over the next couple of years. So there is urgency, but there is agency. We can do this, and we have to do this, because it's not just about us, it's about our children and grandchildren and what sort of world we want to leave behind for them. This is my daughter. I don't want my legacy to be the prospect of us leaving behind a degraded planet for her and future generations. But we still have time to make sure that that is not our legacy. And that's really the point of my presentation. I would love to entertain some questions if we still have time.
Thank you, Mike. This was great. Very, very informative. Wonderful little presentation. So with that, I can see that there were a couple of chats that were put forward, and maybe Roberta is going to take care of keeping track of both chats and hands being lifted.
Great.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm not sure if the people who put questions in the chat want to actually just unmute and ask the questions, or.
That'd be great. I prefer that. It's more personal.
Okay, so first, let me just go to Matt Long, because I see you raised his hand, and then Dave and I think Anarelli, you can come after him if you'd like. So go ahead, Matt.
Thanks, Mike. I enjoyed your talk a lot. I really also appreciate all the work that you've done over the years to bring this issue into the fore. You know, in CGD, we develop Earth system model, and a lot of the framework that we've worked under has been, you know, the CMIP enterprise and really describing sort of the physical basis for climate change.
Yeah.
In many ways, that problem is, you know, solved on certain time scales. What's your vision for how a climate modeling center like NCAR should be effectively engaging in the new climate future?
Thanks. It's a great question. The good news is that we're done with that. We've finished that job. No, I'm just kidding. There's so much left still to do, and those of us who are the beneficiaries of the CMIP simulations that NCAR and others contribute to have learned so much from analyzing them. But we know there's still some you know, unresolved issues. The nexus between climate change and extreme weather events, and this is an area where I've done some research myself. You know, we're not yet resolving the underlying planetary wave dynamics to the extent that I think is necessary to have confident inferences into how climate change is impacting the sorts of persistent weather extremes that we've seen in recent years. You know, some of my own work looks at the phenomenon of planetary wave resonance and the role that that appears to have played with some of these extremes. The models aren't yet at the point where, at the scales that they're run at, where they really capture those linkages, you know, as well as we'd like. Hurricanes, we would like to be resolving, you know, the inner wall structure of hurricanes if we're going to have confident inferences into how climate change is impacting the behavior of these systems. We would like to have two-way interactions, because we know that hurricanes in turn impact the mixing of ocean water, that has a feedback on the atmosphere. So we'd really like to be able to do that in a fully coupled way. And then finally, carbon cycle, fully coupled ocean atmosphere carbon cycle simulations. We've learned how important it is to get that right. To me, one of the most important innovations in our field over the past decade has been the realization that you know, the notion of a carbon budget, that surface temperatures quickly stabilize when you stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And we were only able to realize that when we had a fully coupled framework where we understood the role that the oceans and the biosphere have in taking up carbon and uptaking carbon after we stop emitting it. So I think there's still a lot of work left there to be done in making sure we're really capturing this array of carbon cycle feedbacks, not the least of which is wildfire. Australia contributed more carbon the year I was there in wildfire emissions than they did in fossil fuel burning for all of 2020. And so we don't have those sorts of couplings yet. So I don't see in the immediate future any possibility that there's going to be a shortage of work in the world of climate modeling. And I thank NCAR for all that you folks have done to contribute to what we know, and to continue to contribute to our efforts to sort of sort out the problems that still remain.
Great, thank you. Dave Bailey, you are next.
Sure, thanks. Great presentation, Mike. I enjoy following you on Twitter as well. It's really entertaining, your feed, and it's great the work that you're doing. But so one of the things I see a lot, and it kind of goes into this sort of deflection category, I guess, is this idea that, you know, oil is used for other products, you know, cell phones, solar panels, you know, other products like that. So, I mean, is the message really that it's the burning of the fossil fuels that's the key, you know, I mean, and so can you somehow frame it, or how would you respond to that, I guess, if someone brings that up?
No, it's a great question, and it's one that does come up, and there is a lot of misunderstanding about that. You know, petroleum that's used to make products, well, obviously there are the carbon emissions associated with manufacturing, et cetera.
Sure.
But that petroleum isn't being turned into carbon dioxide. And so you know, there's some other interesting questions that come up. If the fossil fuel industry were to continue, let's say we decided that we would continue to produce 10 gigatons of carbon a year, and we would just redirect that into products, into, you know, petroleum-based products. That's just a huge amount of stuff that is accumulating in the world. And there's some larger questions here about, you know, environmental sustainability writ large. And so I'm not sure that the idea of just redirecting our sort of use of petroleum into products rather than energy solves the larger problem. But there is some discussion about that. There's even discussion about carbon capture, using carbon capture and sequestration and taking that carbon and turning it into stuff so that there is sort of a there's a market mechanism for monetizing that effort in the form of carbon that you're using to make products with. So, you know, these are things that we have to explore and talk about and think about. And there's a much deeper conversation that I think we have to have about environmental sustainability, of which, you know, it's a multidimensional problem of which climate is just one dimension.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Amy, would you like to ask your question?
Good friend of mine,
Sure.
you may.
Hey, Mike, it was really a pleasure to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I'm thinking about is, you know, as scientists, we try to do the best science we can. We try to communicate as clearly as we can. And there seems to me a tension in trying to be an activist and a scientist where you want to always come across and genuinely be objective and maintain this reputation and credibility. And yet when the policy is going so much the wrong way, you kind of need to express urgency and be very frank about the danger. And so I'm asking, and I want to hear your thoughts on what's the right way to maintain the credibility, but, you know, act in the public sphere as you have, maintaining credibility and somehow cutting through the sort of, let's say, mostly a lot of ineffective discussion and arguing, and you know, the media presents everything as sort of a 50-50 opposition.
Yeah, thanks, Aimee. And, you know, Aimee and I were graduate students together back in the early days, back in the early 1990s at Yale University. We were both physics refugees who found a home in the Department of Geology and Geophysics, working with Barry Saltzman on, on climate. And there's a lot of water under the bridge since those days. Yeah. You know, 1995, of course, while we were still there and working on our degrees, we reached the point where there was, you know, now an affirmative statement about detecting a discernible human influence on the climate. So it was a very interesting time to be coming into the field. So, you know, one of NCAR's legacies, of course, is Steve Schneider, who started out there. And Steve, I think more, and you know, I think we all miss him. In fact, the last time I was at the Mesa lab was for an event. It was a memorial to Steve that was held in Boulder some years ago. And, you know, he sort of helped navigate that space for the rest of us, created, you know, I think sort of a blueprint, and spoke very eloquently about this struggle, what he would call the double ethical bind, which is translating it. There are different ways of describing it, but to be maintaining our scientific objectivity while being effective in communicating the reality and threat of the problem. And he said something to the effect that each of us, and his words have been twisted by his detractors, of course, but we each have to come to sort of our own determination of sort of where to draw that line, what feels right for us. And I don't think it's the same for everybody. You know, James Hansen, who has, you know, made so many contributions to the science, but also informing the larger conversation, you know, has been out there getting arrested at pipeline, protests and mountaintop removal sites. Still remember him famously being arrested with Daryl Hannah at a coal mountaintop site. And, you know, I'll tell you where I come out on it. I become a little uncomfortable when it comes down to prescribing very specific policy solutions. I feel very comfortable in talking about the need to price carbon, because I think that is a critical tool in the toolbox, and incentives for renewable energy subsidies. I think, you know, it makes sense for us to talk about the tools that are available to solve this problem. Where I become less comfortable is in trying to prescribe precisely which of those tools should be used. My feeling is that's the conversation that our policymakers should be having in good faith, based on an objective assessment of what the science has to say about the risks that are involved. And so I don't think there's any one hard and fast rule. We all just have to become comfortable in where we draw that line. My friend Gavin Schmidt makes a great point. Look, don't pretend that as a scientist, you can't be an advocate. You're already an advocate if you're just out there explaining the science. You're advocating for an informed conversation. So we're all advocates to some extent if we're involved at all in this larger conversation. And we just have to find our comfort zone. I don't think it's one size fits all. I don't think there's, you know, everybody is going to play a different role. It's an ecosystem.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah.
So Mike, we're actually out of time, but we have 2 more questions in the chat. If you have time, and if you don't, we understand.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so the first question. So the literature talks about future climate change, which makes it seem as if it's a long time from now. What is the definition of future? And could it be said the future is now?
That's sort of a philosophical question. I think it's an important one, right? Because, and I'll tell you why. And there's a fascinating novel. Some of you may have heard about it or maybe even read, The Ministry for the Future, which is sort of about the near future. It's only like, you know, a decade from now where things go. What I like about it, in fact, I'm doing an event with the author, Kim Stanley Robinson, in a few weeks. You know, he puts forward a vision of what a good future could look like. And there are going to be some, you know, difficult moments, some difficult challenges we have to get past, but it is still possible. And he imagines a future where we do combat this problem and we do produce a more equitable and better world as a result of it. And so it's worth reading because it views the future not as some far off distant time. I would note, by the way, along these lines, the movie Soylent Green, I'm sure many of you have seen it. I won't give away the ending. Soylent Green is, no, I won't say it. You got to watch the film. But it was actually in early 1970s, it was premised on climate change. It was premised on global warming. In some ways, it was very prescient. And the year that this film takes place, the year that is unfolding with these events is the year 2022. 2022 was the year of Soylent Green. So it's sort of, and while global population hasn't quite, actually global population is more or less gone where the movie thought it would be, but New York City doesn't have 30 million people, or 40 million people. So it wasn't, you know, it didn't get everything right, but it gave another vision. So there are different visions of our possible future, dystopian visions and more utopian visions, and which road we go down is still a function of our decision making. I think that's the important point here. I think it's also important to recognize that dangerous climate change, we often talk about when does dangerous climate change happen? Is it 1.5 C, 3 Fahrenheit? Is it 2 degrees C? No, dangerous climate change has happened if you're Colorado. It's happened if you're the Western US. It's happened if you're Puerto Rico. It's happened just about everywhere. We are seeing dangerous and damaging and deadly impacts of climate change. Some of you probably read perhaps one of the most direct attributions, unfortunately, that there has ever been of climate change. Just the other day when there was an avalanche due to a collapsing glacier in the Himalayas that looks like likely killed several hundred people. And that can be tied to climate change. The loss of that glacier can be tied to climate change. There's a direct connection. So dangerous climate change has arrived. Our dangerous future is here. It's now a matter of how bad we're willing to let it get.
Okay, last question. How do you recommend communicating science to the public against so much misinformation and disinformation? Should we engage in discussions with climate deniers on Twitter, et cetera, or should we ignore them and continue with our science?
It's a great question. All these are great questions, and sort of ties into something we were talking about before. There's no sort of one size fits all answer, because I think we all play different roles. My good friend and tremendous climate scientist and climate communicator, Katharine Hayhoe, is extremely effective at talking to certain types of conservative audiences, evangelicals. She's an evangelical herself, and so she's sort of viewed as a member of that tribe. She has street cred with that audience. Another good friend of mine, Dave Titley, a rear admiral in the Navy, who is a Penn State grad, meteorology grad, was sort of the official oceanographer for the Navy for a number of years, and has contributed vitally to discussions about the national security ramifications of climate change. And that connects with certain conservative audiences. So, you know, Steve Schneider used to say, know when it comes to communicating to the public, know thy audience, know thy self, know thy stuff. And I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful saying, and it sort of encapsulates all of the components of effective communication. Who are you trying to communicate to? Who's your audience? What's likely to connect with them? Know thyself. Be comfortable, you know, in your own skin. Be yourself. Don't try to be something you're not. Everybody has a different style. My good friend and colleague Richard Alley is a very effective communicator, but nobody else should try to be like Richard Alley. It works for Richard. It's not going to work for someone else. I've sometimes described him as a cross between Woody Allen and Carl Sagan. It's not going to work for anybody else, but Richard pulls it off. So be comfortable in your own skin. Be honest with your audience. Authenticity is critical. An audience is going to see through a facade. And then know your stuff. Well, you know, we have to inform ourselves, not just about the science. We're scientists. You know, I am, and most of you folks in this audience are scientists. But you know, the problem, if we're going to talk about the larger problem, we have to inform ourselves about the other dimensions of the problem, the politics, the economics, the ethics, because we can't have, you know, a real conversation about the problem without, you know, entering into those other domains. And so Steve Schneider recognized early on that it was important for him to inform himself about the other sort of dimensions of the climate problem, not to present himself as an expert in those areas, but to say, look, you know, I'm familiar with the literature, and as somebody who, you know, has colleagues who have informed me and with whom I've talked about this, you know, I think this implies that. And here I'm wearing the hat, not of the scientist, but of, you know, just a citizen who has an informed view of these things. So, you know, that's important as well. But finally, you know, do we try to convince climate change deniers? For most of us, I think that that's probably wasted energy. Climate change denial is on the wane, and those who still deny it come almost exclusively out of an ideological frame. It's no longer about the facts, and you're not going to be able to bust through the front door with facts and data and logic, because that front door is closed. What you need to look for is a side door. Maybe a Katharine Hayhoe or a David Titley can connect with some of those audiences. But for most of us, I would say sort of steer away from hardcore deniers. You're probably not going to convince them, and you're going to waste a lot of time and emotional energy trying to do so. Time and energy that would be better focused on convincing what I call the persuadable middle. They're not climate change deniers. They're just not convinced yet that we really have a problem, or if we do, whether there's anything we can do about it. So a little bit of information, arming them with information and resources, can both activate them, and so that they can help activate other people, and you know, we have to recognize that they are sometimes victims of the disinformation campaign. So when we combat denialist myths and talking points, it isn't to convince the hardcore deniers. We're probably not going to do that, but there's some genuine, honest people who are victims of that misinformation, and we need to disabuse them of the myths that they may harbor. If we can do so, then there's a real potential to move them into that next category of activated, citizens who are contributing to the larger effort to move forward.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I just want to say, so here's my copy. This is actually Todd Amadeo's copy. I borrowed it from him. Thank you, Todd. I'm going to give it back, I promise, as soon as I finish.
Thanks,
so,
Todd.
But this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was great.
Thanks so much, guys. Like I said, really looking forward to actually making it back there one of these days on the other side of this pandemic, and seeing you all in person and doing this again. So thanks, everyone.
Would love to. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.